In the freezing winter of 1944, as the German Wehrmacht launched its final desperate gamble in the Ardennes, General George S. Patton looked at his maps and saw not just lines of steel, but the fragile threads of human willpower. He knew that to win, he did not need to kill every soldier. He just needed to make them believe that death was inescapable from the sky. The history of the Second World War is often written in the blood of infantry and the grease of tank treads. Yet the true architect of the Allied blitzkrieg across Europe was a force far more reaching and terrifying. General George S. Patton, the commander of the legendary United States Third Army, understood a fundamental truth that escaped many of his contemporaries. He viewed the battlefield not as a geometric puzzle of positions to be seized, but as a psychological landscape where the primary objective was the total collapse of the enemy's spirit. While other commanders looked at artillery as a tool for the systematic destruction of physical fortifications, Patton saw it as a scalpel designed to sever the nervous system of the German war machine. He recognized that the roar of 1,000 guns was more than just a delivery system for high explosives. It was a psychological weapon that could induce a state of paralysis, turning disciplined soldiers into hollow shells of men long before the first American tank appeared on the horizon. This was not a war of mere attrition for Patton, but a relentless symphony of violence orchestrated to ensure that the German defender felt hunted every second of every day. To understand the genius of Patton's artillery doctrine, one must first look at the man himself and his obsessive study of military history. Patton believed that speed was the most essential element of modern warfare, and he viewed anything that slowed his advance as a mortal sin. In the early stages of the North African campaign, he observed that traditional artillery methods were often too slow and too methodical, allowing the enemy time to regroup or retreat. He realized that the standard practice of adjusting fire, where a single gun fired ranging shots before the entire battery joined in, served as a lethal warning to the enemy. It gave the German grenadiers precious seconds to dive into their foxholes and brace for the coming storm. Patton demanded something different, something far more sudden and far more devastating. He wanted the first round the enemy heard to be the one that killed them, or at the very least, the one that shattered their ability to think clearly. This led to the refinement of the American Fire Direction Center, a technical marvel of coordination that allowed dozens of separate batteries to link their firepower with surgical precision. Under Patton's relentless drive, the Third Army's artillery became a living, breathing entity capable of shifting its weight across 100 miles of front in a matter of minutes. The core of this doctrine was the concept of time on target, a mathematical feat that required every gun in a designated area, regardless of its distance from the objective, to time its firing so that every shell landed at the exact same second. Imagine the psychological impact of a quiet morning suddenly shattered by the simultaneous explosion of 200 heavy howitzer shells. There was no warning, no whistle of a single ranging shot, and no time to seek cover. Just a sudden, thunderous arrival of absolute chaos that leveled buildings and vaporized morale. Patton knew that this level of sudden violence created a sense of helplessness that no amount of training could overcome. He was not just fighting the German army, he was fighting the very concept of German resistance. He wanted every soldier in the Wehrmacht to feel that the Americans possessed an almost supernatural ability to summon fire from the heavens at any moment. As the Third Army raced across France in the summer of 1944, the speed of the advance was so great that it often outran its own supply lines. But Patton refused to let the artillery fall behind. He understood that the mere presence of American shells in the air provided a protective umbrella for his armored columns. He utilized observed fire with a level of aggression that bordered on the fanatical. Light L-4 Grasshopper planes buzzed over the German lines like predatory insects, their pilots acting as the eyes of the giant. These men would spot a single German Tiger tank or a concealed anti-tank gun, and within minutes call down a concentrated barrage that could saturate an entire grid square. This constant surveillance meant that the German soldier could never feel safe, even in the deep shadows of the hedgerows. Patton's doctrine turned the environment itself into a source of anxiety for the enemy. Every open field was a kill zone, and every forest was a potential tomb. The psychological weight of this constant threat began to erode the cohesion of even the most veteran German units, leading to a breakdown in communication and a frantic desire to avoid being seen. The German commanders, many of whom were veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, found themselves baffled by Patton's methods. They were used to the Soviet style of artillery, which relied on massive, hours-long bombardments that signaled an impending infantry assault. While terrifying, these barrages were predictable. Patton's fire was different. It was sporadic, highly accurate, and seemingly tied to the individual movements of German squads. This harassing and interdictory fire was designed to keep the enemy in a state of perpetual sleep deprivation and nervous exhaustion. Patton ordered his batteries to fire at irregular intervals throughout the night, targeting road junctions, supply depots, and suspected command posts. The goal was to ensure that the German soldier never had a moment of peace. By stripping away the enemy's ability to rest, Patton was effectively dismantling their cognitive functions. A tired soldier is a fearful soldier, and a fearful soldier is prone to surrender. This was the cold, calculated heart of Patton's strategy. Use the technical superiority of American industry to break the human spirit of the German warrior. By the time the Allies reached the borders of the Third Reich, the reputation of Patton's artillery preceded him. German prisoners of war frequently remarked that it was not the American tanks they feared most, but the automatic nature of the American fire. They believed that every American soldier carried a radio that could instantly summon a mountain of explosives. This perception was exactly what Patton had worked so hard to cultivate. He wanted the myth of American invincibility to be rooted in the terrifying reality of his cannons. During the siege of Metz, a city protected by a formidable ring of underground forts, Patton faced a challenge that would have bogged down any other commander for months. Instead of a slow, traditional siege, he used his heavy guns to deliver a constant, rhythmic pounding that rattled the very foundations of the German bunkers. He used concrete-piercing shells not just to destroy the walls, but to create an intolerable environment for the defenders inside. The deafening noise and constant vibration within the cramped, dark tunnels drove the German garrison to the brink of insanity, eventually forcing a surrender that saved countless American lives. Patton's genius lay in his ability to synchronize this mechanical destruction with the movement of his mobile forces. He often remarked that artillery takes the ground, the infantry merely occupies it. This was an exaggeration, of course, but it highlighted his belief that firepower was the primary driver of victory. When his tanks encountered a pocket of resistance, they did not engage in long, drawn-out duels. They simply backed off and let the artillery process the target. This saved his armored strength for the breakthrough, ensuring that his tanks remained fresh and ready to exploit the gaps in the enemy line. This synergy between the long-range punch of the howitzers and the close-in speed of the Shermans created a pace of operations that the German high command could not match. They were constantly reacting to Patton, always one step behind the rain of steel. The psychological impact of this relentless march cannot be overstated. It created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that, no matter how hard they fought, the American machine would simply grind them into the dust of the earth. During the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's doctrine faced its ultimate test. As the German offensive punched a hole through the Allied lines, Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history, pivoting his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a winter storm to strike the German flank. The success of this move rested entirely on the shoulders of his artillery. As his divisions moved north, the guns moved with them, leapfrogging through the snow to provide continuous support. When they arrived at the perimeter of Bastogne, the artillery did not just fire at the German ranks. They fired at the German logistics. They shattered the fuel trucks and ammunition wagons that were essential for the German advance. Patton understood that a tank without fuel is just a stationary target. By targeting the tail of the German dragon, he paralyzed its head. The psychological blow to the German troops, who thought they were on the verge of a great victory, only to find themselves under a relentless, accurate bombardment in the middle of a blizzard, was the turning point of the campaign. Patton's focus on the psychological was also evident in his use of specialized ammunition. He was an early proponent of proximity fuses, a top-secret technology that allowed shells to explode in the air above the enemy's heads rather than on the ground. This meant that foxholes, which provided safety from traditional shells, were now death traps. The airburst showered the ground with a lethal rain of shrapnel that struck from above, leaving the German soldiers with nowhere to hide. When this technology was first introduced during the Ardennes offensive, the effect was catastrophic for German morale. They could not understand how the Americans were able to hit them inside their trenches with such lethal consistency. Patton's willingness to embrace and master these technical innovations allowed him to maintain a psychological edge that was as sharp as a bayonet. He was always looking for the next way to make the enemy feel vulnerable, the next way to prove that resistance was a futile exercise in self-destruction. The sheer volume of fire delivered by the Third Army was staggering, often exceeding the total output of entire German army groups. However, Patton was never a fan of wasteful firing. He demanded that every mission have a specific purpose, whether it was to mask a movement with smoke, suppress a defensive position, or break a counterattack before it could even form. This disciplined application of massive force was a hallmark of his command. He empowered his lower-level officers to make decisions, allowing a captain on the front lines to direct the fire of a lieutenant colonel's battalion. This decentralized control meant that the response time of Patton's artillery was the fastest in the world. For the German soldier, this meant that the moment they revealed their position by firing a single shot, they were met with a crushing response. This punishment for action created a hesitance among German troops, a fear that any attempt to fight back would result in immediate and overwhelming annihilation from an unseen foe miles away. Patton often walked the front lines, not just to inspire his own men, but to see the effects of his doctrine firsthand. He would examine the captured German positions, looking at the craters and the wreckage to understand how his fire was affecting the enemy's psyche. He noticed that the most effective barrages were those that disrupted the enemy's sense of time and space. When a unit is under constant, accurate fire, they lose the ability to coordinate with their neighbors. They become isolated pockets of terror, focused only on their own survival. Patton exploited this isolation by using his artillery to box in German units, cutting them off from reinforcement and retreat. Once boxed in, he would offer them a choice: surrender or face total erasure. More often than not, the psychological exhaustion of the preceding bombardment made surrender the only logical option. This was Patton's war of the mind in its most visceral form, where the physical destruction of the enemy was merely a means to an end. In the final months of the war, as the Third Army swept into the heart of Germany, the artillery became even more aggressive. Patton began using TOT missions on a scale never seen before, sometimes coordinating the fire of over 400 guns on a single target. The sound of these barrages could be heard for 50 miles, a low, rolling thunder that signaled the end of the thousand-year Reich. The German civilians and soldiers alike began to view the American artillery as a force of nature, something as unstoppable as the tides. Patton had successfully transformed a collection of steel tubes and high explosives into a weapon of existential dread. He had proven that in modern industrial warfare, the side that could best manage the psychological impact of its firepower would be the side that dictated the terms of the peace. His doctrine was not just about winning battles. It was about crushing the very will of a nation to continue a lost cause. Even within the Allied high command, Patton's reliance on artillery was sometimes criticized as being too reliant on material superiority. Some generals felt he was softening the enemy to the point where his infantry was becoming overdependent on the guns. But Patton ignored these critiques, knowing that every shell fired was a potential American life saved. He understood that the American public had a limited appetite for casualties, and his doctrine was designed to trade steel for blood. By using his artillery to break the enemy's will, he ensured that his infantry only had to deal with a shattered and demoralized foe. This approach allowed the Third Army to maintain an incredibly high tempo of operations, while suffering significantly lower casualty rates than other units involved in similar levels of combat. Patton was a master of the economy of force, using his most abundant resource, industrial firepower, to protect his most precious resource. The legacy of Patton's artillery doctrine can be seen in every modern military conflict since 1945. The concept of shock and awe is a direct descendant of the psychological warfare waged by the Third Army's howitzers. We see it in the way modern air power is used to paralyze an enemy's command structure before the ground war even begins. Patton was the first to truly operationalize the idea that the brain of the enemy is a more important target than the body. He understood that a soldier who believes he cannot win has already lost, regardless of the weapons he holds in his hands. This realization transformed the nature of artillery from a supporting arm into a strategic tool of psychological domination. As we look back at the campaign across Europe, It becomes clear that while Patton's personality often grabbed the headlines, it was his systematic and brilliant use of shellfire that truly paved the road to Berlin. To see Patton as merely a loud-mouthed, ivory-handled, revolver-wearing eccentric is to miss the cold, calculating brilliance of his military mind. He was a man who understood the intersection of technology and human emotion better than almost anyone of his era. He knew that the sound of an incoming shell was the most terrifying sound a human being could hear, and he used that knowledge to build a doctrine that was as much about psychiatry as it was about ballistics. The Third Army was a hammer, and the German Army was the anvil. But the force of the blow was amplified tenfold by the psychological terror that preceded it. This was the true genius of George S. Patton. He didn't just break the German lines. He broke the German soul. The true terror of the American artillery did not lie merely in the weight of its shells, but in the terrifyingly cold mathematics that governed their arrival. While the world watched the thunderous advance of the Third Army's armor, the real silent killers were the men huddled in the back of canvas-covered trucks, operating the fire direction centers with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. General Omar Bradley, who often worked in tandem with Patton to coordinate the broader American front, marveled at how the Third Army had turned the art of the barrage into a factory-line process of destruction. They stripped away the traditional, slow-moving bureaucracy of call-and-response fire, replacing it with a decentralized network where a single observer on a ridge could command the collective fury of an entire corps. This system transformed the battlefield into a giant lethal grid, where every square yard was pre-calculated and indexed for annihilation. When Patton's time-on-target missions were called, it wasn't just a random bombardment. It was a synchronized execution where shells from different batteries, traveling at different trajectories and speeds, were launched at varying intervals so that they all met at a single point in space at the exact same microsecond. This level of coordination meant that the German soldier was never truly safe, even when the horizon seemed quiet and the American tanks were miles away. The psychological trauma of this instant death cannot be overstated, as it removed the one thing every soldier clings to for survival: the ability to react. By the time the sound of the first explosion reached the ears of a German platoon, they were already being shredded by the 100 shells that followed it instantly. There was no incoming whistle to dive for cover, no frantic moments to scramble into a trench, and no opportunity to brace the mind for the impact. Patton knew that this lack of warning created a primal, instinctive fear that bypassed a soldier's training and struck directly at his will to live. It made the German defenders feel as though they were being hunted by an invisible, omniscient God who could strike them down for the simple crime of existing in the open air. This was the pinnacle of the American industrial military complex, where the sheer output of the steel mills in Pittsburgh was translated into a psychological paralysis on the banks of the Moselle. Even as the Third Army clawed its way toward the German heartland, the specter of Erwin Rommel hung over the battlefield, representing the old guard of maneuver warfare that Patton was determined to surpass. While Rommel had emphasized the daring, localized thrust of the Panzer, Patton understood that the era of the individual Desert Fox was over, replaced by a new age of integrated firepower that favored the side with the better logistics and the more terrifying artillery doctrine. Patton's use of shell fire was the ultimate counter to the German Auftragstatik, or mission command style of leadership. By saturating the German lines with a constant, unpredictable rain of high explosives, Patton effectively cut the lines of communication between the German officers and their men. A commander cannot lead if his messengers are vaporized and his radio operators are trembling in the bottom of a crater. Patton's artillery was designed to create leadership vacuums, where German units were left leaderless and confused, unable to execute the complex counterattacks that had made the Wehrmacht so dangerous in the early years of the war. The contrast between the two styles was never more evident than during the dash across the French countryside. Rommel had relied on the speed of his tanks to create panic, but Patton used the speed of his shells to create despair. He realized that a tank could be outmaneuvered, but a ballistic trajectory could not. As the Third Army bypassed German strongpoints, Patton didn't just leave them behind, he left them under the constant, rhythmic pounding of his long-range, long-tom guns. These heavy 15.5mm cannons would fire at irregular intervals, day and night, ensuring that the bypassed German garrisons were kept in a state of perpetual agitation. This was a psychological slow burn that wore down the nerves of the defenders until they were more than happy to surrender to the first American jeep that drove through their gates. Patton was playing a game of mental attrition, where the goal was to ensure that the enemy's mental capacity to resist was exhausted long before their physical ammunition ran out. As the Allied forces struggled through the Barrages of Normandy, the limitations of traditional infantry tactics became painfully clear. Every hedgerow was a natural fortress, and every field was a potential graveyard for American GIs. It was here that Patton's insistence on overwhelming artillery support proved to be the literal difference between life and death. He refused to send his men against a German position until the artillery had plowed the field. He utilized a technique known as the rolling barrage, where a wall of fire moved just hundreds of yards in front of his advancing infantry. This required an incredible degree of trust between the gunners and the foot soldiers, as any mistake in calculation would result in friendly fire. But Patton's crews were the best in the world, and they maintained a curtain of steel that forced the German defenders to stay pinned at the bottom of their holes. The moment the barrage lifted, the American infantry was already on top of the German positions, catching the dazed and shell-shocked defenders before they could even man their machine guns. This suppression by fire was the key to breaking the stalemate in the hedgerows. Patton understood that you didn't need to destroy every German bunker. You just needed to keep the Germans inside them long enough for your tanks to bypass them or your infantry to toss a grenade through the vision slit. The psychological effect of being buried alive under a mountain of dirt and smoke while the world outside disintegrated was more than most men could bear. When the breakthrough finally came at Saint-Lô, it was the artillery that paved the way, firing thousands of rounds to create a corridor of safety for the armored divisions to pour through. Patton watched the carnage from his command post, noting with grim satisfaction that the German lines weren't just broken, they were being pulverized into the very soil of France. This was the moment where the Third Army truly found its rhythm, a terrifying cadence of fire and movement that would not stop until they reached the gates of Czechoslovakia. To maintain such a relentless pace of fire, Patton required a logistical miracle that remains one of the greatest feats of the war. Every day, the Third Army's guns consumed thousands of tons of ammunition, a hunger that threatened to outpace the supply trucks of the Red Ball Express. Patton treated his ammunition supply with the same intensity that he treated his fuel, often personally intervening to ensure that his artillery batteries were prioritized over other needs. He knew that the moment his guns fell silent, the momentum of his army would stall, and the German defenders would find their courage again. He viewed the supply chain as a conveyor belt of death, stretching from the factories of the American Midwest directly to the breech of his howitzers. This industrial might was his greatest psychological advantage. He wanted the Germans to know that for every shell they fired, he would return 100. He wanted them to understand the sheer, overwhelming disparity in resources that made their struggle not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. The sight of the endless columns of American supply trucks, laden with green-painted crates of high explosives, was a demoralizing vision for the German scouts who observed them. They realized that they weren't just fighting an army, but a continental-scale machine that could produce more iron in a week than the Third Reich could in a year. Patton leaned into this reality, using his artillery as a visible demonstration of American wealth and power. He didn't just fire when he had a target. He fired to remind the enemy that he could fire. This harassing fire was often directed at nothing more than a suspected supply route or a distant forest, but its true target was the German soldier's sense of hope. When you are starving, freezing, and running out of bullets, and the enemy across the field is casually lobbing hundreds of heavy shells at your empty positions just to keep you awake, the realization that you are on the losing side of history becomes an unbearable weight. When the Third Army reached the ancient fortress city of Metz, many believed that Patton's rapid advance would finally come to a grinding halt. The city was ringed by massive, modern underground forts that had been designed to withstand the heaviest bombardments known to man. But Patton saw these forts not as obstacles, but as psychological pressure cookers. He knew that the men inside were safe from the shrapnel, but they were not safe from the sound. He ordered his heavy artillery to maintain a constant, 24-hour bombardment of the forts, using a mix of high explosives and specialized concrete piercing rounds. The goal was not to breach the walls immediately, but to create a sensory deprivation environment that would drive the defenders to madness. The constant earth-shaking vibrations, the dust falling from the ceilings, and the never-ending roar of explosions turned the state-of-the-art bunkers into stone coffins. For weeks, the German garrison lived in a subterranean nightmare, cut off from the outside world and subjected to a level of noise that made sleep and communication impossible. Patton's artillery observers used high-powered binoculars to watch for any sign of movement, instantly calling down a concentrated time-on-target mission on any German soldier who dared to step outside for a breath of fresh air. This total lockdown of the fortress perimeter meant that the Germans were trapped in their own defenses, slowly losing their grip on reality. When the forts finally began to surrender, the American troops were shocked to find German soldiers who were physically unhurt but mentally destroyed, their eyes vacant and their hands trembling uncontrollably. Patton had proven that even the thickest concrete in the world could not protect a soldier from the psychological consequences of his doctrine. He had turned the very strength of the German defenses against them, using his artillery to transform a fortress into a prison of fear. As 1945 dawned, the Third Army prepared for its final act, the crossing of the Rhine River and the invasion of the German Heartland. Patton knew that the Germans would fight with the desperation of cornered animals to protect their home soil. So he prepared a symphony of fire that would dwarf everything that had come before. He massed every gun he could find, from the light 75mm pack howitzers to the massive 8-inch blackjack cannons, creating a density of fire that was unprecedented in the Western theater. The crossing was preceded by a bombardment so intense that the very air seemed to vibrate with the force of the explosions. Patton didn't just target the opposite bank, he targeted the very soul of the German resistance. He wanted the defenders of the Rhine to feel that the world was ending, that the heavens themselves were collapsing upon them. Under the cover of this massive umbrella of steel, Patton's infantry crossed the river with surprisingly few casualties. The German defenders, who should have been raining machine gun fire down on the crossing boats, were instead huddled in the bottom of their trenches, too terrified to even look over the parapet. The psychological impact of the American artillery had reached its zenith. As the Third Army spilled into the German interior, the resistance began to crumble at an accelerating rate. Town after town surrendered without a shot being fired, the mayors waving white flags at the mere sight of an American spotting plane. The reputation of Patton's automatic fire had done the work for him. The German people had seen the devastation of the front lines and wanted no part of it. They understood that to resist was to invite the total and absolute erasure of their homes and families. Patton had successfully weaponized the concept of inevitable destruction, using his artillery to clear a path all the way to the heart of the Nazi state. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the world began to take stock of the destruction. The Third Army had traveled further, faster, and captured more prisoners than any other unit in American history. While Patton's leadership and the bravery of his tankers and infantry were celebrated, the silent hero of the campaign was the artillery doctrine that had made it all possible. Patton had fundamentally changed the way the United States Army thought about firepower. He had moved the focus from the destruction of physical objects to the destruction of the enemy's will to fight. This was a revolutionary shift that would define American military strategy for the next century. From the rolling barrages of the Korean War to the shock and awe campaigns of the 21st century, the DNA of Patton's Third Army artillery can be found in every major American operation. The lessons learned in the mud of France and the snow of the Ardennes were codified into the training manuals of the post-war era. The concept of the Fire Direction Center, the importance of time on target, and the psychological necessity of constant harassing fire became the bedrock of Western military thought. Patton had proven that in the age of industrial warfare, the side that could best synchronize its technical superiority with a deep understanding of human psychology would always emerge victorious. He had shown that a commander's greatest weapon was not his sword, but his ability to project a sense of overwhelming, unavoidable power that made the enemy's defeat seem like a foregone conclusion. This was the true strategic genius of George S. Patton, the realization that the shortest path to victory lay not through the enemy's heart, but through his mind. As we look back at the cinematic scale of the Second World War, it is easy to get lost in the grand movements of armies and the clash of ideologies. But if you listen closely to the echoes of history, You can still hear the rhythmic, thunderous beating of Patton's drums. It is a sound of absolute authority, a sound that reminds us that war is not just a contest of steel and muscle, but a brutal, intimate struggle of wills. Patton understood this better than anyone, and he used every tool at his disposal to ensure that his will was the one that prevailed. He was a man of his time, an eccentric and often difficult leader, but his contribution to the science of victory cannot be denied. He didn't just win a war, he redefined how wars are won, leaving behind a legacy of fire and fear that continues to shape the world we live in today. The Third Army's march across Europe remains the ultimate testament to the power of a single idea, that the most effective way to save lives is to break the enemy's spirit with such speed and violence that they have no choice but to lay down their arms. Patton's story is a reminder that in the face of total evil, the most merciful act is often the most overwhelming application of force. By using his artillery to shorten the war and collapse the Nazi regime from the inside out, he saved millions from the prolonged agony of a war of attrition. He was a man who lived by the sword, but he used that sword with a surgical precision that remains a study in military excellence. The thunder of the Third Army has faded into the past, but the lessons of Patton's psychological warfare remain as relevant today as they were in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. He taught us that to win, you must not only be stronger than your enemy, but you must also be more terrifying. This is the cold, hard truth of the battlefield, a truth that George S. Patton understood better than anyone who has ever worn the 4 stars of a general. If you were a commander in 1944, would you have prioritized the safety of your troops through overwhelming firepower like Patton? Or would you have focused on more traditional surgical infantry tactics? Let me know your strategic choice in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.